Back in the autumn of 1884, the wind on the Wyoming prairie was a harsh sculptor, scraping the land down to bone and grit. It found its way into every crack, every seam, every sorrow-etched line on a man's face. For Thomas Beckett, barely past 20 summers, the wind was a constant companion, a mournful voice that seemed to echo the silence inside him. He lived alone on a small, struggling ranch carved out of the unforgiving land 50 miles from the nearest collection of buildings that dared call itself a town. His father, a man consumed by dreams as big and empty as the sky, had chased them right into a flash flood 2 years prior, leaving Thomas with a mortgaged claim, a handful of scrawny cattle, and a solitude that pressed in on him like the horizon. His days were a relentless cycle of chores under a sky that could be brutally bright or bruised with the promise of ice. Mending fences, searching for strays, hauling water, chopping wood. The physical labor was a dull balm against the sharper pain of loss and the gnawing worry of failure. He had little contact with anyone. The few ranch hands his father had employed drifted away after the funeral, finding work with men who could pay regular wages. Thomas learned to rely on his own 2 hands and a silence that became less a burden and more a habit. When he spoke, it was usually to his horse, a steady bay mare named Bess, or to the cattle, low murmurs against the vast quiet. Loneliness was a tangible thing out here, heavy in the air after the sun dipped below the world's edge, leaving him alone with the stars and the wind. He was young, yes, but the prairie had weathered him like an old fence post. His hands were calloused, his eyes held a distant, weary look, and his mouth rarely curved into a smile. He carried the weight of his father's unfinished dreams and his own stark reality. He was isolated by distance, by circumstance, and by a grief he hadn't allowed himself to fully name. He existed, day in and day out, a solitary figure against an immense, indifferent landscape. One raw afternoon, the sky spitting a cold, sleety rain that clung to everything, Thomas was riding the northern fence line, cursing the endless task. The ground was slick, the wind bit through his worn coat, and his mood was as gray as the clouds overhead. Bess picked her way carefully along a low ridge overlooking a shallow, rocky creek bed. As he crested the rise, a patch of disturbed earth caught his eye. It wasn't a washout. The soil was mounded, unnatural. Curiosity, a rare impulse in his predictable life, pulled him closer. He dismounted, the wet leather creaking. The mound was oblong, about the length of a person. A terrible unease settled in his gut. It looked like a grave, but crudely done, the earth still loose. Then he saw it, a piece of dark cloth, patterned with faint red and white shapes, caught on a thorny bush near the edge of the mound. It was not the fabric of any white settler he knew. His heart hammered against his ribs. He knelt, ignoring the cold mud soaking his knees, and began to dig with his hands, the metal of his belt buckle scraping against the stones. The earth was cold and heavy. Fear mingled with a grim determination. Who would be buried here, alone, and why did it look so hasty? His fingers struck something solid, yielding. Wood, not a coffin but planks, shoved together. He scrabbled at the dirt faster, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He cleared away the soil and found a rough box, like something quickly nailed together from salvaged lumber. It was just large enough to hold a body, and shallowly buried. There were holes in the top plank, crudely punched through. Then he heard it, a faint sound from within the box, a ragged breath, a soft moan swallowed by the wind. He froze, his blood turning to ice. Someone was inside, and they were alive. A surge of adrenaline, cold and sharp, cut through his fear. He grabbed a fence post lying nearby, a heavy length of timber, and began to lever the planks free. The wood groaned, the nails protested. He worked with desperate urgency, ignoring the biting cold and the protest of his muscles. The last plank came free with a splintering crack. He knelt and looked down into the shallow box. Curled on her side, wrapped in layers of dark, damp cloth, was a woman. Her face, pale and drawn, was turned towards the holes, her eyes closed. Her dark hair was matted with dirt. She was small, frail-looking, and undeniably Navajo. The cold rain had plastered strands of hair to her forehead. She looked impossibly young, perhaps 18, as the headline had described, maybe younger. Relief, raw and dizzying, washed over him, quickly followed by a wave of confusion and dread. Why was she here? Who had done this? His mind raced with questions, none of which had easy answers. He reached down, his hand trembling, and gently touched her shoulder. Her eyes fluttered open, dark and wide with terror and confusion. She stared up at him, a stranger with dirt on his face and a wild look in his eyes, framed against the gray sky. She didn't speak, couldn't speak perhaps. Just looked at him, her breath coming in shallow, trembling gasps. You're alive," he stammered, the sound of his own voice loud in the sudden quiet. He carefully reached into the box, his movements slow and deliberate, trying not to startle her further. He helped her sit up, supporting her back. She was weak, shivering violently, whether from cold or terror or both, he couldn't tell. He pulled off his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. It was inadequate against the biting wind, but it was something. Getting her out of the box was awkward. She was stiff and sore, her limbs protesting the movement. He lifted her carefully, supporting her slight weight, and set her gently on the muddy ground beside the makeshift grave. She collapsed against the wet earth, her legs giving out, still wrapped in his too large coat. He knelt beside her, unsure what to do next. He couldn't leave her here, not like this. The implications of what he had found crashed over him. A young Navajo woman, buried alive on his land. This wasn't just a random act, it felt deliberate, brutal. Who had done this? Her own people. If the cloth suggested tribe, outsiders, the thought made his stomach clench. Taking her in meant trouble. It meant questions he didn't know how to answer. Judgments from a world he mostly avoided. It meant bringing the complexities and dangers of the outside world right to his doorstep. But leaving her was unthinkable. The harsh code of the prairie demanded resilience, yes, but it also had an unspoken law about leaving folks to die, especially like this. "My place isn't far," he said, his voice rough. Can you walk?" She looked at him, her dark eyes searching his face. She didn't understand English, he realized with a fresh wave of helplessness. He gestured towards Bess, then towards where his ranch lay hidden in the dips and rises of the land. He stood up slowly, offering her a hand. She hesitated, then tentatively reached out, her fingers cold and frail in his. He helped her to her feet. She swayed, gripping his arm for balance. Every movement seemed to cause her pain. Getting her onto Bess was a challenge. She was weak and clearly hurt. He had to lift her most of the way, settling her side saddle in front of him, her back against his chest. She was feather-light. He mounted behind her, gathering the reins. Her shivering didn't stop. He could feel the tremors running through her body. The ride back to the ranch was slow and silent, save for the moan of the wind and the soft thud of Bess's hooves on the wet ground. He held her loosely, acutely aware of her presence, her vulnerability. He thought of his ma, gone these 7 years, and the quiet strength she possessed. He thought of the simple human decency she had instilled in him. His small cabin looked even more desolate than usual as they approached. A single plume of smoke rose from the chimney. He had left a low fire burning. He dismounted first, then carefully helped the woman down. She nearly fell, but he caught her, his arms wrapping around her waist for a brief, awkward moment. He steered her towards the cabin door. Inside, the air was warmer, thick with the smell of wood smoke and stale coffee. He helped her to the single chair by the hearth. She sank into it, pulling his coat tighter around her. He added more wood to the fire, the sparks leaping. The flickering light illuminated her face, revealing a large bruise on her temple and several cuts on her hands. Her clothes were torn and mud-caked. He knelt by the fire, unsure what to do next. He needed to clean her wounds, get her warm, find her something to eat. His resources were meager, his experience with caring for another person, especially a stranger, especially a woman, let alone a Navajo woman, was non-existent. He felt a fresh wave of panic mixed with a strange sense of responsibility. He rummaged in a small cupboard and found a clean, though worn, cloth. He poured water from the kettle into a basin and let it cool slightly. He approached her carefully, the basin in his hands. She watched him with wary eyes, like a cornered animal. He spoke softly, using simple gestures, pointing to her temple, then to the cloth and water. I want to help," he said, knowing she wouldn't understand the words, hoping she understood the intent. She flinched slightly when he reached out, but didn't pull away entirely. He gently dabbed the cloth in the water and began to clean the dirt and dried blood from her temple. Her skin was cold. He worked slowly, meticulously, his brow furrowed in concentration. He cleaned the cuts on her hands next. They were deep, as if she had scrabbled desperately at the wood or the earth. When he finished, he wrapped her hands loosely with strips of cleaner cloth he tore from an old shirt. He then took the wet cloth and wiped the dirt from her face, revealing more clearly the sharp planes of her cheekbones, the delicate curve of her jaw. Her eyes remained fixed on him, a mixture of fear and something that might have been hesitant curiosity. He heated some water and made a weak broth from dried vegetables, the only thing he had that seemed suitable. He brought it to her in a tin cup. She looked at it, then at him. He nodded, encouragingly. She took the cup with trembling hands and sipped slowly. The warmth seemed to bring a faint flicker of life back into her eyes. The silence in the cabin stretched, thick with unspoken questions and anxieties. He sat across from her, watching her, trying to decipher her expressions, her needs. He noticed the intricate beadwork on the edges of her tunic, the simple silver bracelets on her wrists. They were beautiful, fragile things that seemed out of place in the starkness of his cabin. He wondered about her life, her people, why she had been left for dead. The thought of it, buried alive, sent a fresh chill down his spine. What kind of desperation, what kind of cruelty, led to such an act? He had only one bedroll and a thin blanket. He laid the bedroll near the fire, where it would be warmest. He gestured for her to lie down. She hesitated again, then slowly, stiffly, eased herself onto the bedroll. He covered her with the blanket, tucking it gently around her shoulders. She closed her eyes, her breathing still shallow. He sat in the chair she had vacated, watching the fire, listening to the wind howl outside, and the quiet, fragile sound of her breathing. He didn't know what the morning would bring, but for now, she was safe. Days blurred into a quiet rhythm of caretaking. She was badly injured, weak from dehydration and whatever trauma had been inflicted upon her. Thomas tended her wounds, made what little food he had stretch, and learned to read the subtle shifts in her expression, the slight movements that indicated pain or a need. She remained mostly silent, her dark eyes following his movements. She learned his name, Thomas, repeating it softly, tentatively, her voice a low murmur. He learned hers, Nahili. It felt like a secret shared between them. Communication was a slow, careful dance of gestures, sounds, and intuition. He showed her how to cup her hands for water, how to point to indicate hunger or pain. She learned his routines, the times he milked the cow, fed the chickens, checked the fences. She couldn't do much at first, but her presence filled the cabin in a way the solitude never had. It was a quiet presence, but it was there. As she slowly regained her strength, she would sit by the fire, her gaze fixed on the flames, her expression distant, often melancholic. He knew instinctively that her past was a heavy burden, something she carried within her like a stone. He didn't press her for answers about what had happened, about why she was left for dead. It wasn't his place, and he sensed the depth of the pain the memories caused. He simply provided a safe space, food, warmth, and the quiet, unassuming protection of his presence. He saw glimpses of her resilience, the way she endured the pain of her injuries without complaint, the slow but steady return of strength to her limbs. She watched him work, her eyes sharp and intelligent. One afternoon, while he struggled to knot a difficult rope splice, she quietly reached out a hand, took the rope, and with swift, practiced movements, tied a perfect knot he'd never seen before. It was a small thing, but it spoke volumes about her knowledge, her capabilities, hidden beneath her vulnerability. The quiet truce between them began to deepen, evolving into a tentative trust. He no longer felt the sharp edge of fear or the crushing weight of dread every time he looked at her. He saw a young woman, hurt and alone, possessing a quiet strength he admired. She, in turn, seemed to lose the constant wariness in her eyes when she looked at him. A faint smile would sometimes touch her lips when he did something clumsy, or when Bess nudged her gently for attention. He taught her a few simple English words, pointing to objects: fire, water, horse, sky. She learned them quickly, her pronunciation soft and musical. In return, she taught him a few words in her language. The sounds felt strange on his tongue, but saying them, attempting them, felt like a bridge built between them, a small act of crossing the divide. The outside world remained a distant threat. He couldn't keep her hidden forever. He knew the danger she faced, both from whoever had left her for dead and from the ingrained prejudice of the white settlers in the nearest town. They didn't look kindly on outsiders, especially native people, and the idea of a young white man sheltering a Navajo woman would be met with suspicion, judgment, and likely hostility. He had always lived on the fringes, but having Nahili here felt like he was drawing a target on his back. As winter approached, the land became even more unforgiving. Snow fell, blanketing the prairie in a vast, silent white. The cold was absolute, brutal. They were confined to the cabin mostly, relying on the stores he had managed to lay in during the warmer months. The forced proximity deepened their connection further. They shared stories without words, communicated through glances, gestures, the quiet comfort of shared space. He learned to anticipate her needs, she learned to anticipate his. They fell into a comfortable routine of coexistence. He mended fences when the weather allowed, checked on the cattle huddled against the cold, while she tended the fire, mended clothes, and somehow, with a few simple tools he provided, began crafting beautiful, intricate beadwork, her fingers nimble and precise. Her work filled the small cabin with unexpected color and life. The prejudice he feared materialized, slowly but surely. He had to go into town for supplies eventually, a difficult trip through the deepening snow. The few people he encountered looked at him differently. Questions were asked, oblique at first, about his solitude, about strange sightings near his land. He deflected them, his answers brief and guarded. But he felt the weight of their suspicion, the cold judgment in their eyes. One particularly harsh day, a small group of riders appeared on the horizon. 3 men from the town, led by Bartholomew Price, a man known for his narrow mind and loud opinions. They rode straight for his cabin, their horses kicking up snow. Thomas felt his gut clench. They had come for her. He went outside to meet them, standing between them and the cabin door, his rifle held loosely in his hand. Nahili stood just inside the doorway, silent and still, a shadow against the dim interior. Price's eyes, cold and hard, swept past Thomas to the figure in the doorway. "Beckett," Price said, his voice carrying on the wind, sharp and accusatory. "Heard you been keeping secrets out here." "Got nothing to hide, Price," Thomas replied, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. That woman in there," Price pressed, gesturing crudely. "Folks are talking, say you're harboring trouble." "She's hurt," Thomas said simply. "Needed help, that's all." "Help? From you?" one of the other men sneered. "What's a white man doing mixed up with her kind? She likely caused her own trouble." Thomas felt a surge of protective anger, hot and unfamiliar. He hadn't realized how deeply his feelings for Nahili had grown until they were threatened. "She's under my roof," he said, his voice low but firm. "That makes her my responsibility. You got no business here." Price dismounted, stepping closer. "We got the business of keeping this territory clean, Beckett. Her sort brings nothing but grief. Her own people cast her out, I hear. Maybe they had good reason." Thomas raised his rifle slightly, the movement small but definitive. "Get off my land, Price, now." The 3 men exchanged glances. Price weighed the look in Thomas's eyes, the set of his jaw. He was young, but there was something in him now, something hard and resolved, that hadn't been there before. Price sneered again, a nasty twist of his mouth. "This ain't over, Beckett. Folks won't forget this." They remounted their horses, sending snow flying, and turned back the way they came. Thomas watched them go, rifle still raised until they were specks on the horizon. He lowered the weapon, his hands shaking slightly. He turned and went inside. Nahili was still standing by the door, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear, but also something else he couldn't quite read. He walked over to her, the silence heavy. He wasn't sure what to say. The confrontation had forced a choice, a public stand. He had chosen her. "They won't come back soon," he said, his voice softer now. "Not in this weather. We'll be all right." She looked up at him, her dark eyes searching his face. Then, slowly, she reached out a hand and touched his arm, a feather-light touch that conveyed more than words. It was a gesture of trust, of silent gratitude, and something that felt undeniably like affection. In that moment, surrounded by the quiet of the cabin and the vast white silence outside, The isolation he had known for so long seemed to recede, replaced by the fragile, powerful presence of connection. The winter was long and hard, but the tension from the confrontation with Price solidified something between them. The threat lingered, unspoken but understood. They were together in this, two solitary figures against the world and its judgments. Nahili's strength grew daily. She helped with the chores, her movements efficient and quiet. She could ride best now, sitting straight-backed and graceful. She learned more English, her vocabulary growing word by slow word. Each new word a step further into his world, a bridge between theirs. She began to speak, hesitant at first, about her past. Not about why she was buried, that pain was still too deep, too raw, a scar he didn't dare touch directly. But she spoke of her life, her family, the beauty of her people's traditions, the stories whispered under the desert stars. He listened, mesmerized, catching fragments, piecing together a picture of a life so different from his own, yet filled with universal human experiences: love, loss, belonging, pain. He told her about his own life, the ranch, his father's dreams and failures, his mother's quiet strength, the loneliness after they were gone. He found himself telling her things he had never spoken aloud, things he had kept buried inside him like stones. Her presence drew them out, gentle and non-judgmental. Sharing their stories, their vulnerabilities, wove an invisible thread between them, stronger than any rope. One evening, huddled by the fire against a fierce blizzard, he watched her work on her beadwork, her brow furrowed in concentration. The firelight cast dancing shadows on her face. She looked up and met his gaze. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, the silence filled with a quiet understanding, a deep, burgeoning affection that had bloomed unexpectedly in the harsh landscape of their lives. "Thomas," she said, her voice soft, "thank you for saving me." "Anyone would have," he murmured, but he knew it wasn't entirely true. Many wouldn't have stopped, or if they had, wouldn't have risked taking her in. "No," she said, her gaze steady. "Not anyone, not like this." She gestured around the small cabin, the warmth, the safety. "You saw what they did. Who I was. And you chose." She paused, searching for the word. "Chosen kindness." His chest felt tight. It was the right thing to do, Nahili. She smiled then, a small, genuine smile that lit up her face. "Sometimes," she said, "the right thing is the hardest thing." The spring came reluctantly, melting the snow in fits and starts, turning the land into a muddy, treacherous mess. But with the spring came a sense of renewal, of possibility. The threat from the town hadn't vanished, but it had receded during the winter. Thomas knew they couldn't hide forever, and Nahili knew it too. They needed supplies badly. The trip to town was unavoidable. They discussed it, the tension palpable. Nahili offered to stay behind, to hide. But Thomas shook his head. "No," he said. "If they see me alone, they'll know you're still here, or worse, gone. We face it together." It was a moment of quiet commitment, a statement of their bond. They would ride into town side by side, facing whatever judgment came their way. The day they rode into Redemption, the town's ironically named settlement, the air was thick with the scent of spring mud and nervous anticipation. Thomas rode Bess, Nahili, on a smaller, sturdier horse he'd traded for. She wore a simple dress he'd found for her, but her dark hair was braided with bright ribbons she had woven, and she wore her silver bracelets. She sat straight in the saddle, her chin held high, a picture of quiet dignity. Eyes turned as they rode down the dusty main street. Conversation stopped, heads turned. The silence that fell over the town was louder than any shouting. Thomas felt the weight of every stare, the cold assessment, the open hostility from some faces he recognized, including Bartholomew Price, standing outside the general store, his arms crossed, his expression venomous. They dismounted in front of the general store. Thomas helped Nahili down, his hand on her arm, a small, unconscious gesture of protectiveness. He felt her slight tremor, but her gaze met the stares of the townsfolk unflinchingly. "Need supplies, Miller," Thomas said to the store owner, a balding, nervous man named Joseph Miller, who stood frozen in his doorway. Miller swallowed hard, glancing past Thomas at Nahili. "Beckett. I don't know as I can sell to you." Price stepped forward, a triumphant smirk on his face. See, Beckett? Told you. Nobody here wants trouble. This ain't right, bringing her kind here. She's a person, Price, Thomas said, his voice calm but carrying. She's been hurt, she needed help, and she's found it. She's a heathen, a woman's voice called from the small crowd that had gathered. Bringin' bad luck and worse. Nahili stepped slightly forward, her gaze sweeping over the hostile faces. She spoke then, her voice clear and surprisingly strong, though her English was still halting. I did not bring trouble. Trouble found me. She gestured towards Thomas. He found kindness when others buried me. A gasp went through the crowd. The raw honesty of her words, the stark image of being buried alive, seemed to momentarily stun them into silence. Even Price looked taken aback. Buried? Mila stammered. Yes, Nahili said, her dark eyes holding theirs. Left for dead, by my own. He dug me up, gave me warmth, gave me food, gave me life. She looked at Thomas, and a profound tenderness softened her face. He is good man, not like you think. Price recovered quickly. She's lying, trying to spin a tale, likely ran from her tribe after doing something terrible. Maybe so, Price. Thomas said, stepping closer to Nahili, standing shoulder to shoulder with her. Maybe her past is complicated. Whose isn't? But what she is now, under my care, is safe. And that's all that matters to me. He looked around at the faces, some hard and unforgiving, others showing hesitant curiosity, perhaps even a flicker of sympathy stirred by Nahili's simple, powerful declaration. I won't run her off, I won't turn her away, she has a place with me. He didn't say love, he didn't say future, but the quiet conviction in his voice, the way he stood beside her, spoke volumes. It was a challenge to their prejudice, a public declaration of his choice, of their bond. Price sputtered, red-faced. You're making a mistake, Beckett, a big one. Thomas didn't back down. He looked at Miller. Supplies, Miller, or I'll take my business elsewhere. Miller hesitated, glancing between Price's fennu and Thomas's quiet resolve, and the unsettling gaze of the Navajo woman. He was a businessman, and Thomas, though poor, was a customer. More importantly, perhaps, he was a man making a stand, and Miller, deep down, knew the cruelty of leaving someone buried alive. Slowly, nervously, Miller nodded. All right, Beckett, come on in, get what you need. The tension didn't dissipate, but the immediate confrontation was over. As Thomas and Nahili walked into the store, leaving Price fuming on the street, they could still feel the weight of eyes on their backs. But something had shifted. They had faced the judgment, and they had not broken. They had stood together. Buying supplies was quick and quiet. Miller was nervous, avoiding eye contact. As they left the store, Price was still there, glaring, but he didn't approach. Thomas helped Nahili back onto her horse. As they turned to leave town, Nahili looked back at the faces watching them. She didn't look scared anymore. She looked resolute. The ride back to the ranch felt different. Lighter, despite the muddy trail. They had faced the storm of human judgment and emerged, still standing together. The isolation of the ranch, once a symbol of Thomas's solitude, now felt like a sanctuary, a place they had built together, away from the narrowness of the world. Life didn't magically become easy. There would be whispers, ongoing judgment, perhaps even more direct threats down the line. Their future together in this place was uncertain, challenging. But as they rode, side by side, the vast prairie stretching out before them, Thomas felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The wind still howled, but it no longer sounded like a lament. It sounded like a song of resilience, carrying the promise of a future built not on broken dreams, but on unexpected connection, quiet strength, and a love that had grown from the ashes of loss and the cold earth of a shallow grave. They reached the ranch as the sun began to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The cabin looked small and humble, but as they approached, it felt like home. Not just a house, but a place where two disparate souls had found refuge in each other, creating warmth and belonging in a world that had tried to cast them out. They dismounted, and this time, as Thomas helped Nahili down, she didn't tremble. She met his eyes, and in her gaze he saw not fear or despair, but quiet hope, a reflection of the hope that had finally, tentatively, bloomed in his own heart. They walked towards the cabin together, two against the vastness, their steps firm on the thawing ground. The silence between them was no longer empty, it was filled with the quiet, powerful language of shared survival, mutual respect, and the profound, unexpected love they had found in the most unlikely of places.